Okay, we can go ahead and get started. Um, some announcements to start. The hack challenge is ongoing. You guys have a midpoint submission due on the end of the day Monday. It's like zero weight, but we just want to see that you have something. Um, please submit that as part of your deadlines. And your final submission for the hack challenge will be graded based off of just the guidelines that are in the slides. Um, so as long as you complete all the guidelines with the set number of screens that you need or whatever, you'll get the full points. And then our first bonus lecture is going to be on Monday, next Monday, and it's going to be on the Android job search. And so there's a bunch of cool things that Justin's going to go over, and that'll hopefully be very useful to you. And we'll likely have another one on Wednesday. So make sure to show up for those. Um, Okay, and then for today's demo, we're going to be practicing with Retrofit. Um, and again, this is working with fetching data from a server. So more specifically, I will be demoing using a API from API Ninjas. That's going to be like a sentiment analysis. So basically, you'll put in a blurb of text, and then it'll return like how positive or negative it thinks it is. Um, and so there is space in this demo for you to choose your own API to work with, since the starter code is pretty generalized. But if you want, you can also just follow along with the sentiment API. So yeah, the starter code is up on the textbook, and then we want to go over just what the API documentation looks like really quick to start. So this is the API that I will be using in this demo. And as you can see, there's a lot of different ones you can choose from here. You'll see it'll tell you an endpoint. So this is how you'll actually specify which API you're using when you're using Retrofit in Android's or with Jetpack Compose and Kotlin. Um, and then there's a bunch of information that'll give you about what exactly you need to do in order to use it. So parameters are going to be what the API needs in order to like, in this case, you need to give it text so that it can actually analyze something. Headers, you'll need this for every API Ninja API. It's just your personalized key. And response is going to be what the API is returning to you. So in this case, it'll give you the sentiment analysis score, the actual sentiment, and then it'll return the text that you gave it to start. And so you'll notice here that this API is returning a JSON. And again, we don't actually have to touch the JSON at all because that's what Retrofit is doing for us. So it'll process all the JSON information into some data class that's useful for um, Android development, I guess. So you don't necessarily have to interact with the JSON at all. And yeah, so to start, you'll be working with setting up the API interface. So to go over the starter code, you'll be working in this retrofit folder and the API service file. And yeah, so you'll just complete the to-dos. You'll have about 15 minutes to do that, and you can pick your API as well if you want. And we'll walk through that in a bit. Oh, so I should have thought of that. I guess like you can think about the same concept of like substance things Texas. Yeah, so you would have been yes, I think so. So you just industry, or in that case, you just remove the question mark. Um, you can still default still, but oh yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, okay. I mean, Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and start the walkthrough. So for our first step, we wanted to replace the endpoint with the actual API that we're using. And in this case, it'll be the sentiment API, or it like corresponds to what you see here. And that's what you're gonna put into this get so that Retrofit knows like where to get like or which API it's using. So we're actually defining like the full path to this API or API ninjas here in the Retrofit instance. So that's why once we're in the API service, we only need to specify a specific like API. So oh, next, we're going to go ahead and put in our required like queries and our header. So at query, and we can call this whatever we want, but in this, I guess you can match it to the response that it's actually, or the parameter. So it's going to be text, my bad. That's going to be of type string. Okay, and then we did get a question about whether or not this should be nullable. So when I was making this demo, I actually found out that the empty string is, if we set this default to an empty string, it's like functionally null to the API, since like what a query essentially does is put your parameter into the call to the API. And so if it's an empty string, the API still doesn't really know what to do with it. So I guess whether or not you make it nullable is dependent on other things. So in this case, when we actually go to, there's another part of the code where we have to use another function to access the text that the user inputs. And that function requires like a nullable type. So that's why in this case, we actually do use a nullable type, but not for the API specifically or retrofit specifically. So sorry if I misexplained that the first time. Um, so yeah, it'll be a nullable. Um, and we can just put the empty string as a default for now. And we'll like catch that later in like an if else statement to make sure that doesn't like crash the app if it is null. And then since text is the only parameter this API requires, we can move on to the header. And I'll just copy my header from over here. And again, this is like your unique API key that you get from your account. So if you notice, we have the parameters and the headers done now, and the response is what we're gonna like represent in our data type that we're gonna make. So we can call this a data class. We can say sentiment response, and then it's like arbitrary what you name this class. And then we'll say value. We take a score, text, and sentiment back. So score of type float. Um, text of type string, and then our sentiment. And I did define a sentiment enum class ahead of time here. So we can just call that type sentiment. Okay. And so I defined the enum class because here sentiment returns like discrete values. So you can just go ahead then and define those specifically within your code. And so now that we have the data class like represented, we need to specify what this get function, this get data function is returning. And that's going to be the sentiment response type. And so this is important because this is what's like, this is the only thing that's telling Retrofit what exactly it's mapping the data it gets, like what it should do with that data. So the suspend function, get data, we're querying the text, we give it the text as a parameter in the query, and then that's going to return some kind of data. And then so Retrofit needs to do something with that. And in our case, it's going to return the sentiment response type. So yeah. And later down the line, for convenience, I did write a empty version of this data class. So really quickly, zero f empty string and neutral. Okay, and so yeah. Does anyone have questions about this part of writing the actual API service? Okay. So now that you have like the data from the API, essentially, you can go ahead and start working on like building out the view models. So you can think about like the API service as the model. So in this case, like your database type of idea. And so your view models and your view models are going to use this to actually like use the data to like do the processing that it needs to do for the view. So you can go ahead and get started on the next part, which is building out the screens and the view models. Um, again, like following the to-dos within the code. And yeah, you'll have about 15 minutes and then like feel free to ask questions. Okay, I'll go ahead and start the walkthrough for this part now. So first of all, we're passing in our retrofit instance to our view model so that we can access the data. We'll start with result view model. And then the UI state, again, is what we're actually going to be passing to the views or the screens. So they should contain all the data that the screens need to display. And in this case, our screens, again, are showing like just the text again, our score, like number, and then like the actual sentiment, like type. So um, if you notice, that's like the same type that we defined in our API service with the sentiment response. So since that's like the same type and that like contains everything that we need to display, we can go ahead and just return um, something of that type in the UI state. So we can just call this data. Ideally, you'd want like a more descriptive name. Also with like within the API service, um, get data and like sentiment response, you'd want like descriptive names. We just made it, or I just made it more generalized this time so it could accommodate like different kinds of APIs, if that was the case. So for the data, again, it'll be type sentiment response. And then we'll actually have to update that data within the load data function. So to actually get this data, we want to use a call to the get data function that we did, and that'll actually give us this data. So to store that somewhere, we'll say, um, again, some arbitrary, arbitrary name to temporarily store this data. And then we'll access it through the retrofit instance. And then we'll use the dot. We can see we have access to the API service, and that's where our get data function is actually going to be. And so we do need to pass in the text that the user is going to input. And in this case, this is going to be from this line of code here, query. So in the actual like finalized project, I guess we're taking the input from one screen and then we need to access it in another screen. So this code is basically just taking like passing this kind of argument within the navigation. And this is also why we had to make the type here a nullable type for the text, because this returns a nullable type. So just to make that work. And then we have to update the UI state so that the screen is actually getting like recomposed whenever new data is sent. So we're going to do that with the UI state flow and then value. And then we use a copy function, or dot value, and then dot copy. The copy function is just allows us to change only the values that we need. So in this case, the UI state has a loading like property and a data property. And since if we're returning like data now, we know that the loading is complete. So we can go ahead and change loading to false. And then our data is going to be what we just fetched is from the sentiment. Okay. And then if we finish up building out the screens, do we have an error? Oh yeah. Mm, Sure why that's an error right now, but we can come back to that. So for the results screen, we actually have to display this data now. We have our result view model, and that should give us everything we need once again from the UI state that we're calling here. So realistically, we only need like three text boxes or text components in order to display all of this. So to start, we can say text equals, and pull this up for reference, UI state, text, and that'll be the text that we got from the UI state. So next we want to display our actual sentiment score. And we're going to have to do a toString to kind of cast this to a string since the score is a float type. And then same thing with the actual sentiment type. So we'll also have to do a toString here because right now it's an enum type. ToString. Yeah, and then that should display all of the data that we need. And yeah. Okay. So one more thing, as I mentioned before, like the null, passing in a null was an issue because it would like crash the app. So I guess because Retrofit expects some kind of argument for the text, because that's like a required parameter. So to kind of catch that case, we can go ahead and do an if else like kind of block to only call the retrofit like function if we know that the query isn't null or blank. So there's a convenient function for that called is null or blank. And so we want not is null or blank. And if that's the case, then we know we can go ahead and call these to get our data. Otherwise, we want to display some error state. So in this case, it can just be like um, the easiest way to do it is just to create a custom kind of case of the data that'll tell the user that they have an error. So we'll go ahead and copy this. And so we'll want to change our data to an actual sentiment response. And we can say that's score of 0F again, text. Or no input, and then a sentiment of, we can say neutral. Import. Okay. And then okay. So now to handle this, I think this is a text. We need to set the default here. So empty. Okay, sorry, let me figure this out. This bug out really quick. Okay, we have a default. Okay. So, okay, that's the issue. So the data is, again, we defined it as, or I guess we need some type of data to display. So we need a default value there. That's why it was like upset over here. So now this should all be good. And if we run it, everything should be connected. I think the main view model should be okay since it doesn't actually use the retrofit instance. Does anyone have questions at this point? Sorry, it's been a little bit convoluted. Good. Okay. We can go ahead and run and hopefully it works correctly. So, and it'll take the loading state, and then it does print a value. Um, let's try something else and see if it gives. Okay. So it does give a slightly different score there. So if you try a couple different things, it should give you different scores. Um, and yeah, so once again, to kind of go over very high level, we start with the retrofit instance, and this is where we define which, or like the base URL or which API we're using. API service is going to be where we're actually getting our data from the API. So that's why we specify which exact API Retrofit should get the data from, and then what type it should map the data to. And so now that we have the data, we can send it into the view model, and the view model is going to use that data. We have the UI state, so it needs to pass some kind of data to the UI. And then after it's done, like calling all of that, we can go ahead and access it from the UI. And yeah, so if there are any questions at this point, it is time. So if we come back, we have the attendance and the A5 feedback form. Um, and other than that, you'll just be continuing to work on your hack challenge. And then we do have the bonus lectures next week that we hope to see you at.